One long-standing issue related to sport is that of labor, especially the case of athletes' labors, as athletes are the primary producers of sport. More recently, scholars such as Amira Rose Davis have argued the need for studying Black women's sporting labor. And in this paper, I do just that by briefly investigating an early collective bargaining agreement in the WNBA. As you might know, the NBA helped to establish the WNBA in 1997. Today, the WNBA is the longest operating professional team sport league for women in the United States and features a predominantly African-American playing force. The Women's National Basketball Players Association, or WNBPA, was established in 1998 as the first labor union for professional women's team sport. As with other players' unions, the WNBPA negotiates collective bargaining agreements, facilitates the filing of player grievances, and helps to develop post-career opportunities for WNBA players. After years of collective struggle with different CBAs along the way, the WNBA and the WNBPA signed a new collective bargaining agreement in 2020 that several observers characterize as progressive, as the CBA allows for better salaries with maximum salaries over $200,000, better working conditions, and better benefits. Other critics suggest that there is much more work to do to value Black women's sporting labor, and studying the historical struggles around pay and working conditions illuminates the continuous need for cultural change. This is also important as labor history in sport largely excludes women's sports, and thus this presentation helps to bridge that gap. Additionally, this investigation helps to shed light on the fact that players in the WNBA have engaged in collective struggle well before their more highly visible activisms around racial and gender justice, perhaps most visibly apparent in their 2020 Say Her Name campaign, in which players in the WNBA COVID bubble brought attention to Black women and Black trans women's status as disproportionately being killed by police. It is important to understand recent advocacy then as part of a longer lineage that includes collective bargaining mediation in the fight for better pay, working conditions, and the valuing of Black labor. Drawing upon critical cultural studies and feminist intersectional conceptualizations, this paper returns to the League's first CBA in 1999 to outline key elements of the players' quest toward fair compensation and better working conditions. I do so by examining WNBPA documents and popular media accounts. The resulting historical narrative further explicates dominant gendered, racial, and class labor politics at play in the United States at the turn of the 21st century. Indeed, as will be elucidated in this presentation, the players' struggle in the early years of the WNBA is the latest in the line of player advocacy in professional team sport around compensation and working conditions. And yet, the Players Association 1999 advocacy happened during a particular moment in history in the broader cultural, which had already witnessed a precipitous decline of organized labor. Organizationally, I'm first going to contextualize this presentation, and then I'll move on to some brief ideas related to collective bargaining in sport more broadly. And then I will make connections between players' pay and working conditions to broader trends of the devaluing of labor, particularly Black women's labor. Then NBA Commissioner David Stern helped to launch the WNBA in 1997 to monopolize the professional basketball market and keep NBA arenas occupied in the summer months when WNBA would play. As I have argued elsewhere, the emergence of the WNBA occurred as part of an accelerated set of changes of post-Fordism that allowed capital greater freedom to expand labor markets, create new products centered around lifestyle, taste, and experiences, thus reshaping patterns of consumption while generating fresh images and emotionally salient narratives that eventually would proliferate beyond traditional advertising and media spaces. These conditions helped to enable sport industry expansion into not just the WNBA, but such sports as arena football and the X Games in the 1990s. And while advertisers have traditionally sold sport to men of means, in this increasingly niche-oriented but still cluttered neoliberal sport marketplace, women, racial minorities, the young, and those embodying active lifestyles have been and are increasingly recognized as both participants and potential consumers of sport. The broader increasing emphasis on entertainment and in consumption were, of course, accompanied by the capitalist quest to seek greater profits, which also saw the movement of heavy industry from North American cities to newly industrializing countries, thanks to capital's ability to exploit those nations' cheapened labor and lower costs. While the manufacturing sector was never completely obliterated, the later portions of the 20th century saw the United States rapidly transitioning toward globally connected information, entertainment, and service sector economies. Governments simultaneously slashed social safety nets and geopolitical situations shift. Accompanying this set of changes has been a decline in organized labor. This includes the decline of private sector service unions as a percentage of the US labor force from a high of over 40% in 1954 to just 10% in 1999 when the WNBA Players Association was formed. The reasons for the decline are numerous, including outright hostility expressed by capital to union organization, establishment of laws that allow employers to intervene into and influence organizing processes, individualistic approaches that turn unions inward towards settling grievances instead of recruiting more members and creating more unions nationally, and the increasing salience of globalization that weakened organizing given capital's international reach and the fragmentation and local character of organized labor. Of course, to speak to the decline of labor unions more broadly is to ignore the complicated condition which allowed labor unions and collective bargaining processes to emerge and to acknowledge those that still exist. This is an important issue to investigate, since despite a comparable decline in membership from the 1970s onward, Black workers are still more likely than other races to be unionized, embodying roughly 14% of the union workers, while composing about 12% of the US population. Over the course of the 1980s and the 1990s, Black union workers across the United States increasingly were more likely to be older, female, foreign-born, have more years of formal education, and work in the public sector. These demographics and important shifts suggest the need to explore the collective efforts of the predominantly African-American playing force of the WNBA. Upon completing the 1999 WNBA collective bargaining agreement, after an original agreement collapsed a week earlier when both sides accused the other of changing an agreed upon set of details, then WNBA President Val Ackerman praised the final four-year deal by stating, "This is a milestone for our league to have its first collective bargaining, the first of its kind in women's team sport. It speaks volumes for how far women's sports have come. The agreement reflects the commitment made to providing a first-class working environment for our players." Whether the 1999 agreement reflects first-class working conditions is, of course, open to debate. However, as historians and sociologists have long argued, thanks to the power of the gender binary, the celebration of masculinity through sport, and player advocacy, North Americans men's professional team sport athletes have enjoyed this opportunity to collectively bargain for decades. For example, the NBA Players Association was formed in 1954 With the first comprehensive NBA CBA signed in 1970, which included a player's salary increase from $20,000 to $30,000 per season. The early men's pro team sports collective bargaining agreements, court rulings, and mediation radically altered the character of professional team sport, providing player mechanisms to articulate their relative collective economic interests so that their athletic labor might be better valued. In a similar way, the first WNBA collective bargaining agreement in 1999 would feature a players' association with 2 player representatives per team and an executive leadership team. And it also began to shift the WNBA landscape. Under the leadership of WNBPA Director Pam Wheeler, the union was able to secure several items, which I won't read out here, but you can see in the slide, for the WNBA's then 32-game, 3-month season. And as I say, the provisions are listed on that screen. The CBA would also allow for the inclusion of 40 players from the once rival, but then recently defunct American Basketball League, or ABL. While concessions were made, the NBA, much as with those who could have capital more broadly, have the upper hand in shaping the outcomes of the 1999 collective bargaining agreement. At this time, the league was exclusively owned by the NBA, with 12 individual team owners operating WNBA franchises in their cities. And within this one owner league model, the NBA also exerted tight control on expenses and revenue streams. This created a double-edged sword. On the one hand, WNBA was able to survive its entry into the professional ranks due to the economic power and name recognition of the NBA. Yet on the other hand, prior to collective bargaining, the league especially contained player compensation, keeping wages low, including by initially denying free agency, which was subsequently granted in 2003, while also suppressing possible revenue streams. This was accomplished by using pre-existing NBA marketing strategies, which some critics suggested were unsuitable for the WNBA, while also denying teams the ability to negotiate local sponsorship deals with competitors of the WNBA national sponsors, as is allowed in the NBA, as this would have raised additional revenue as well. The demise of the ABL also meant less competition for the players, further cheapening their value, once again helping to solidify the owner's upper hand in labor negotiations. While certainly these tactics and conditions articulate to a list of ways in which professional sport team owners have long sought to deny fair compensation to players, given the historical exclusion of Black women from sport and other workspaces, these practices and issues around the WNBA are reminiscent of a longer history whereby Black women's labor has been devalued. Historically, Black women's jobs in the United States were disproportionately located in low-wage agricultural and domestic service, where they were excluded from progressive reforms such as New Deal minimum wage and overtime provisions. A combination of racism and sexism meant until the 1970s, Black women were largely excluded from higher paying jobs, and even today continue to be overrepresented in low paying service sector jobs that lack employer provided retirement plans, health insurance, paid sick and maternity leave, and paid vacation. And while often written out of historical accounts, despite these exclusions, many Black women have also been a part of organizing for better wages and working conditions. For example, Dorothy Lee Boulder in 1968 founded the National Domestic Workers Union of America to fight exploitation, linking labor and civil rights struggles. In this current moment, as visible union organizing takes place across North America and the globe during a global pandemic, no less, for example, at Amazon, Starbucks, and amongst the fight for 15 and a living wage, the collective bargaining struggles of the WNBA players further reveal just how much more work there is to do toward gaining more equitable pay and working conditions, both within sport and beyond. Thank you very much.